Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be back.
Yeah.
We're not going to
Welcome back.
We're not going to do movie lines
From your mixed
anymore.
martial arts expedition.
I know, right?
How'd that work out for you?
One day I'll be a kickboxer. One day for sure.
Sure.
I'm convinced. It's not going to get me down. I'll be right back at it. Okay.
Well, you're healing. That's what's important.
So we're so happy about this case. We've talked about it a couple of times before we got our decision.
Yeah. So while you were on sabbatical, we talked a little bit about this historic win where we were able to get expert evidence of a male battered partner into a case, and Diana didn't have a chance to talk about it. And there was a lot of aspects to it. So we're going to just come back to it for this episode because there's some aspects that are really good. And this was one of the most, I guess, interesting.
This was really emotional for me, this case.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm gonna make it through this without crying, but I didn't at trial. Remember? And I was like, yeah, I started crying at trial, and then I remember you turned around and I was like trying to wipe my tears away, and he was like, I hope the judge saw you crying. Well, it was hard not to. It was like, there's some cases that are more emotional than others, but it's so funny because I never realized what a girly girl I am.
Well, I mean, these cases are impactful. I mean, it's just,
I know.
I've run so many cases. It's like, lawyers have hearts too, but but what was really telling in this one because this one was done by Zoom, just the verdict, and our client was in our small boardroom, and after the verdict was completed, after the decision was read, he was immobilized and just crying for several minutes.
So was I.
No, but he was really immobilized. Like it was such a relief, such an accomplishment to be able to be believed and have that evidence of his abuse recognized. Yeah. We talk often about how this is, you hear in the media and everything, how it's important for, a victim of real violence to be able to have their day in court and be believed and have some sort of a verdict at the end of the day, have closure. For him, this was it was a transformative process. Mm-hmm. So at the beginning, you had said that this was somebody who needed therapy just to be able to deal with the process.
Yeah, it wasn't just for the purposes of the court. I was like, you need to have therapy because you're in so much danger. You cannot be in a relationship until you learn to set boundaries and protect yourself against toxic people like this. And it was just so amazing that, like I mentioned before, he was calling me almost every week at the beginning. Yeah. And then it would be like a month. And then at one point I realized that like 3 or 4 months had gone by and I was like, oh, I know you're doing better because I haven't heard from you for a while. And he goes, I really am.
The therapy really worked.
I know. And but one of the interesting things he said when he was testifying was that as part of his therapy, he had to recognize that he had to care for himself.
Yeah. Should I carry on while you're going to cry now?
I know.
Okay. I'm just kidding.
But baby.
The only time I cry is when I get those really big bills out. I'm like, oh my God, this is a good one. Okay.
Don't laugh at me.
I'm just kidding tonight. All right, so let's get serious.
You go.
Have a shot. Let's talk about it because it was very emotional and it was a very important case for a number of reasons, but two aspects that I think I wanted to talk about with you that I didn't have a chance to talk about when Michael was on the podcast was really about how one of them. So we're going to say how this expert evidence will factor into issues in the future, and it's only in rare cases, frankly, because you have to have a situation where it's genuine and we were able to tease it out and it was legitimate. But it was relevant to two very central aspects. One was to the assessment of credibility. An expert can't give evidence about what's the ultimate issue, which is deciding credibility. But an expert can talk about what somebody's experiencing, what they have experienced, what the symptoms are, and the diagnosis. And then that aspect of the evidence can be used in the assessment of credibility. And I think we should talk about that a little bit so people understand. I think it's very instructive.
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about, what people can do is like, oh, I'll just call. Same thing was like, oh, I've got tons of character witnesses who say I'm such a great person or whatever. They think I'll just bring in an expert who can tell them that she's lying or something like that.
Yeah, and you can't.
They're not allowed to do that.
It's a very specialized area. That it was used in this case, and experts are only for very specialized issues for which a juror or a jury would not ordinarily know, and there has to be real science and study behind this expert evidence, which is why often we assail some of the evidence that comes out in the Crown's case, where it's really just based on junk.
Yeah. Well, and also in this particular case, in terms of talking about a man being the battered spouse, then we start getting into areas which are still, I think, really not developed well enough, which is stereotypes about masculinity.
Yeah, so let's talk about two aspects, which I think is really important here to focus on. One will be about the assessment of credibility, but before that is the, and we've talked about the myths about men, male masculinity, male aggression, male sexual aggression, but it's still in a lot of cases, and recently 2 major cases that we've had, if not 3, there was very clear evidence that the complainant had grounded her allegations in stereotypes about men, whether they were cultural male aggression stereotypes or just male aggression stereotypes. They were very clearly grounded in it and right out. So in this particular case, let me just set the stage and you can talk about it. But the evidence was clear that the complainant had said, after we were married, he switched.
As soon as we were married.
As soon as we were married, he switched. And he became this traditional, I'm going to be careful about how I say this because we don't want to disclose anything that could identify anybody in this case, but he became this traditional man who believed that he owned his wife and could do whatever he wanted, and his wife had to obey him, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right, like she became his property.
Property. Yeah. Well, she was saying all of this, frankly.
Yeah.
And it was very similar to another case where again, it was stereotypes about a cultural aspect of how a man from this community would believe that the wife was his property, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not a rarity, right? We hear it all the time. Like, God forbid, if we're asking questions or cross-examining out of the blue, alleging a stereotype about how a woman would be...
Or a real victim.
No, but a woman from a cultural background, would behave or act or whatever. If we tried to link it anyway, I'd have a razor blade through me, right? Mm-hmm. And we're careful not to do that. But these stereotypes, even though there's case law addressing it, I'm going to turn it over to you now, they're alive and well when witnesses give their statements to the police. And, sorry, I haven't eaten today. I'm on a diet. And when they testify, and it's just lead.
Right. So we were kind of lucky with this case in that there was a fair bit of messaging between the two people.
Fair bit. There was a lot.
There was a lot of messaging. And so that's one of the aspects of this case, which I thought, it's so important to get through, because there's a lot of people who are trying to figure out, what kind of evidence can I get to provide to my lawyer? And, it can be very difficult for people to look at their own messages and sort out what's useful and what isn't.
But before you get into messaging, can I just ask you, from your perspective, you're doing these cases with me. Do you notice sort of the prevalence of these male stereotypes?
Yeah, well, so here's the interesting thing with this case is that the complainant offered 2 messages to the police in which our client was saying sorry. So just on their own, it would look like he's admitting to guilt in some way. But once you go through, and we had this plethora of material to compile, and it tells the bigger picture, which is this is a person who was saying sorry for anything. He was saying sorry for breathing, practically. And so, if you were to look at the messages, like, why would you want to use that as defense? It looks like your guy's done something really wrong. It's like, no, when you put it together, and we had something like 25, messages all compiled and stuff.
Well, we start off with
over a time
several hundred.
I know. There's probably thousands of pages. I don't know. But he was really helpful. But once you see the whole picture and you see the kinds of things he was apologizing for, and we've kind of mentioned a few of these things before, he got kicked out of his own house just for buying her a gift. And so...
lying about getting a gift.
And then saying, oh, no, we weren't talking about you. Oh, well, then he's branded a liar. and for the rest of the relationship. So once you start seeing all these things, it paints the picture more fully. And then of course, we get into the issue of how much is too much, right? So like it takes a lot of work to sort out which things are compelling and which things are important. But that's part of the art of defending people and really telling their story. And like you mentioned before too, like a lot of people, they just feel like they never get a chance to tell their story. And that is one thing. I remember Christy Blatchford writing an article once questioning whether it was better to go to trial and get a chance to tell your story, or whether it was better to just never be charged because it's just social media or having charges withdrawn. And of course, we'd always say it's like you never want to put your life in jeopardy if you don't have to.
Yep.
But I saw her point, because there is something within the soul of an accused person where they simply want to have a chance to tell their story.
Well, I've experienced it a lot of times over 30 years where a client has said to me, I want to take the stand, and I want to. First, I'm a firm believer in, especially in sexual assault cases, that in order to be successful, 99% of the time you have to call your client. But there has been plenty of occasions where the clients have said, no, I absolutely want to testify. Like I want to speak to this. I've been waiting a long time to be able to tell the truth. But can I just borrow that for 1 second? Because the case for just 1 second. I just want to look at the paragraph for 1 second, because I'm hung up on this episode about the stereotypes. And there's a lot of case law. Is this yeah. So there's a lot of chatter, and there's a lot of
there's a number of cases that we rely on quite frequently that they mention in here. And that's one of the ones that he mentions is JC by Justice Pacheco. And the important thing about that case, and he highlights the most important part, which is that it's not a stereotype if it's grounded in evidence. And that's the job, is like, something may sound like a stereotype, but when you look at the individuals and you look at the messages and you put all these things together, if it's grounded in the evidence, then it becomes a fact, or most likely a fact, because of circumstantial evidence. Right. But then if you just speculate that a certain person would behave a certain way if they were an actual victim or whatever, like you're speculating about how a general person would behave, that's where it goes astray.
You're absolutely correct. So we've had other episodes where we've talked about the developments in case law, like I think that's the JC decision from the Court of Appeal and Chepik and other cases, to talk about courts have said don't rely upon myths about male sexual aggression or how males would act in a certain context for sex, whether if they're young males, etc. There have been very good strides in the case law. But
also about, too, like an assumption that women would be passive.
Right.
Because that was the Chepik thing, was like there was a woman in a strip club, and so the judge decided that a young woman would never behave a certain way. It was like, you're talking about somebody who's at a strip club, and it was like there were assumptions made about how a young woman would behave.
But what I'm hung up on, and everybody has to pardon me for this, but what I'm hung up on is just how much we've seen in the last year of this being a leading part of the evidence of the complainant about these stereotypes. And in this case, it's extremely fortunate, and this is where the assessment comes in. Like you were saying, we had hundreds of messages. We were able to distill them down, I think, to 25 or 35 messages that did a very good job of telling what the true story and the true dynamic was between our client and the complainant. And a lot of it was not just him being passive and saying, I'm sorry for existing, but the complainant being very domineering, exerting coercive control, micromanaging everything he does, including his access to the washroom, where he could do his work, when he could be in the apartment, what he could, surprise her with, all of that. But we had it.
I remember.
Just one thing, and then
the surprise thing.
Okay, go ahead. So I don't want you to lose that thought.
It was like the one thing is like he got thrown out of the apartment for trying to get her a surprise gift, and then there was a moment in the cross-examination where he then says, "Oh, I'm planning a surprise for her anniversary," and he had to tell her what it was. And I remember in the cross, you're just like, he learned his lesson, didn't he?
That's right. But what we had, so the complainant in this case, like so many others, grounded her evidence in this switch where he became this traditional male aggressor owning his wife. But we had messages and we had expert evidence. So again, you can imagine all those cases where that's not available to an accused. And in particular, the judge found that there are a number of areas in which I found the complainant's evidence to have been disingenuous in attempts to mislead the court. But equally as important, I do not accept, it's an aspect of this, that there was a sudden personality change, like something switched, as suggested by the complainant, but then him reverting to being passive and acquiescent, as reflected in the text messages and his psychological profile relied upon by the defense.
Right.
Let's just pause there for a moment. How incredibly important it is when defending cases, because there still is this prevalence of grounding allegations in myths and stereotypes about men. Maybe sometimes it's applicable, okay? But we're seeing it across the board, that we had these messages and we had the psychological profile proffered by the client, the messages, and then ultimately by the psychiatrist.
And again,
how important.
Yeah, and again, the expert didn't go in there and say, oh, he's credible because blah,
of
blah,
course
blah.
Not.
They can only testify about what they're qualified on, and the credibility assessment is ultimately going to be up to the fact finder, whether it's the judge or the jury. So the experts, again, just so people don't misunderstand,
Explain it slowly so everybody understands.
Yeah, just
the limits
thinking,
of what you can do with an expert evidence.
Yeah, just thinking, oh, well, we'll just get an expert and then they can say that she's a liar or she's mentally ill or something like that. And it's like people really don't understand, experts have to be qualified. They have to usually have, written something in their field that's been peer reviewed. So that's one part of it. But there's also extreme limitations on what it is they can testify about.
Expert evidence has to be relevant to an issue at trial, but not the ultimate issue. They can't comment on credibility of the complainant or credibility of the accused. They can comment on relevant issues. In this case, it was about his psychological profile and the complex trauma he was suffering that undermined the whole narrative of the complainant. And so this is where expert evidence now is relevant, and we have precedent for it, to assessment of credibility. It doesn't resolve the issue, but in particular,
it makes something more or less likely to be true.
And the judge made a very important point. I found the complainant's description of the accused as being controlling and entitled to have been disingenuous and incongruent in the face of numerous text messages displaying his passive, apologetic personality, a person who is trying continuously to avoid conflict. I accept the evidence of the expert that the accused displayed the characteristics of a person with a complex trauma, hypervigilant, passive, and apologetic, who sought to please the complainant to avoid her anger, which appeared easily triggered. So, this is exactly how you can use expert evidence in a case like this to address the issues of credibility. And I guess my pet peeve for this podcast is, it's so easy still to say, he became controlling, he switched, he saw me as property, he did this and that, and it's because of his views, cultural or otherwise. And how incredibly important it was to have these messages, to spend the hours that you did and I did going through them, and then the hours to how to line them up for cross-examination, and then have this expert evidence. I mean, I'm this case was so important for that, and it's just such a challenge. And we have to be alert to this in the field, that when these stereotypes continue to be used, courts are not as vigilant as they should be to say, hold on. Mm-hmm. Where's this coming from? What's the basis of this? That doesn't happen. They just say it. It's in the interviews. It's in the evidence. You don't have to rebut this. You can be up the creek. I guess this was the lingering thing from our discussion I wanted to talk to you about so much on this, how it's factored into rebutting that presumption of male aggression, which seems that you have to rebut it still. And we needed the expert evidence and how relevant it was to assessing credibility in this case, because he accepted the psychological profile. Imagine if you don't have this.
I know. And there's like something that we see quite often, I think, too, is just that this idea that, opportunity, right? Oh, if a guy has an opportunity to take advantage of a woman, they're absolutely going to take it. And it's like, there's just insane assumptions about, and one of the things that we've mentioned in some of our closing submissions, too, is this concept of toxic masculinity, which is creeping its way in. And
there is, let's be fair though, there is good case law from lower courts and the Court of Appeal trying to address that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
but not good enough.
But the assumption
you really want to say something. What? Just be careful, mindful.
I'll just leave. I think that's one of the things that there was a bit of a split with some feminists, even where they're just, when toxic masculinity started becoming a buzz phrase, that there was a little bit of a split too, because you know what, women do like men.
Yeah.
And this whole thing of trying to demonize men is just, it's gone too far. And sure, okay, some certain things can happen, especially in certain types of environments, people get carried away or whatever, but there's toxic femininity too. So I don't like the idea of a phrase that demonizes either gender just by the sake of their gender. So
no, and the language used can become so commonplace and so defining and lead to such stereotypes and wrongful assessments that's where it leads us down a very bad path.
And that's also so important about this case too, is like we had mentioned, one of the former Supreme Court judges said, I'm not saying that men can't be battered spouses, but
although rare,
if you're going to make that argument, you better have an expert.
Yeah, well, to her credit, and we quoted this in the other episode, that Laura Dubé said that it's so poorly understood that you're going to need expert evidence for a judge or a jury to understand it and then properly apply it in context. And here it was.
But this isn't the only case of a man who's a battered spouse. I mean, I've in my travels through YouTube and through the nonprofit and stuff, I've heard horrible stories about men being beaten and humiliated and stuff, and there's almost no shelters for them and things like that too. So
sadly, there's just a new case that came into the office that we still have to get the disclosure, but the complainant has pictures of certain injuries, not certain injury, like a little bit of bruising and scratches and stuff, and it's the same allegation. He was a very domineering, controlling, misogynist ex, and he beat me on a regular basis. And then the client's in the office going, like, I didn't realize she was taking pictures, but yeah, we had struggles, and you know what? I suffered real injuries. We had physical fights. She hit me with like a glass or a cup, so I would be defending myself. And then I asked, well, why'd you stay with her? Right? The stereotype, right? And he's like, well, for the children. And he said, but I never took pictures of anything. I didn't think ever about going to the police. Yeah. I didn't know she was like trying to build this case against me. And now he can't see his children.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things.
Just came in.
So one of the things we're hoping with this decision is that it can kind of open up the doorway for men's voices to be heard when in fact they are the one who was the real victim in the case.
And men not to be laughed at when they're in court testifying to say, this will lead us into another decision in another podcast, but men not being laughed at or being scoffed at as to how they would behave or react to something allegedly. Like a man would never put up with that. They would leave the marriage, or they would do X, Y, and Z. Right. For a man still to come out in his own defense in a trial to say what our client did, or this other gentleman who just retained us, still would be met with a fair amount of skepticism, sometimes scoffed at, for making that assertion in the defense. It had legitimacy because we had the messaging and we had the expert assessment and evidence.
Yeah. And also they shouldn't be humiliated.
No. Anyways, this is an important one to follow because it's going to factor into some of other defenses.
It was a really important win.
Well, have a good night. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Sorry if this was a little repetitive, but God, I can't escape the implications of this case. And anyways, so
like, subscribe, hit notifications,
share
share the videos,
send
leave
comments, send us
comments.
emails. Thank you very much. Good night.